Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a war happening right now, somewhere in the dark between the stars, being fought without banners, without declarations of holy purpose, without the thunder of 10,000 boots marching in unison toward a fortified line. No ecclesiarchy priests are distributing pamphlets about it. No recruiting drives are painting its warriors as heroes on the walls of hab blocks in the underhive. The commissariat has not issued any inspiring proclamations about the nobility of dying in this particular conflict, because the people responsible for those proclamations do not know the conflict is happening. The generals of the Astra Militarum have not been briefed. The High Lords of Terror, sitting in their impossibly ancient chambers on humanity's home world, surrounded by 10,000 years of accumulated ceremony and authority, have not convened any special session to address it. They declared this war's participants dead, officially, publicly, on the imperial record, and then they went about their business. They were wrong, of course. They have been wrong about this particular matter 3 separate times across 10 millennia, and each time they issued a fresh declaration of victory, the organization they were declaring dead demonstrated its continued existence through acts that were embarrassing in their precision and infuriating in their audacity. The third time the High Lords of Terror officially confirmed the eradication of the Alpha Legion was during the 39th millennium, and the Alpha Legion has been quietly, methodically, and devastatingly active in every century since. This is the story of the 20th Space Marine Legion, and the last legion created by the Emperor of Mankind, the most secretive force in the history of warfare, and the only traitor legion that has managed to remain genuinely operational for 10,000 years, while the other fallen legions slowly corrode inside the Eye of Terror, or diminish into scattered warbands too small to matter. Understanding what the Alpha Legion is requires understanding not just what they have done, but how they think, why they think that way, and what it is about their particular relationship with the truth that makes them different in kind from every other faction in this galaxy. Because here is the thing. Every other major power in the 42nd millennium has something you can point to. The Black Legion has Abaddon and his titanic personal grudge against the Imperium. And they stage enormous crusades out of the Eye of Terror that light up the galaxy's threat boards like festival illuminations. The Death Guard spreads plague with the devoted enthusiasm of an entity that has given itself over entirely to entropy and disease, and their movements carry a horrible inevitability that at least makes them predictable. The Necrons have their ancient dynasties and their cold mathematical approach to reclaiming what they consider their rightful territory, and while their plans extend across geological timescales, they operate from real physical positions that can be mapped and assessed. Even the Tyranids, arriving from beyond the galaxy's edge with their vast, incomprehensible hungers, have a logic you can eventually describe. The Alpha Legion might be inside the Imperium right now. Their operatives might hold positions of quiet trust inside the Administratum. Their recruits might be children currently sleeping in the dorms of an Imperial Skolum on some world you have never heard of, being shaped by teachers whose loyalty the Skolum's headmaster would be horrified to question. Their cults might be meeting in some basement 3 streets from a garrison where perfectly loyal Space Marine scouts are running training drills. The Imperial citizens walking past that basement would have no idea. The Space Marines in that garrison would have no idea. The governor of the planet would have no idea. The Inquisitor assigned to monitor that sector might have no idea, or might have every idea, or might herself be the product of a conditioning process that began before she was born. This is what the Alpha Legion does. Well, this has been what the Alpha Legion does since before the Horus Heresy tore the galaxy in half, and it remains what they do now, in this grim darkness of the far future, more sophisticated and more patient and more deeply embedded than at any previous point in their extraordinary, maddening, infuriating history. Their symbol is the Hydra. Their war cry is Hydra Dominatus, dominion of the many-headed serpent, the creature that grows back whatever you cut off. And cutting them off, as 10,000 years of imperial effort has demonstrated, is very nearly impossible. Let us begin at the beginning. Imagine you are a Space Marine commander in the early years of the Great Crusade. You have been given your orders and your army and sent out into the galaxy to bring every human world back into the Emperor's light. You have been fighting alongside your brother legions for decades now. The Dark Angels are recognizable by the bone white of their early heraldry and the particular quality of focused, almost spiritual intensity that their warriors project. The Ultramarines are in their brilliant, carefully maintained blue, and their Primarch Guilliman is already developing the organizational philosophy that will eventually define what a Space Marine chapter looks like for the next 10,000 years. The Space Wolves are magnificent and slightly terrifying, and everyone gives them space when they are in a good mood, which is not as often as one might hope. You know these forces. You have fought beside them. You can predict, roughly, what each legion will do when placed in a given strategic situation. There are reports, though, that have been circulating among certain very careful individuals for years. Reports of Space Marines who answer to no known legion. They carry no recognizable colors and no heraldry that any remembrancer has ever successfully catalogued. They pass through war zones on authorization codes that cannot be questioned, not by colonels, not by generals, not by other Space Marines, not apparently by anyone. They conduct assassinations, and when they are done, the people who might have described them are not available to do so. They carry out abductions of individuals who subsequently cease to exist in any official record. They perform acts of sabotage so clean and complete that for weeks after the event, the target organization does not realize that anything has happened, at only gradually discovering through cascading failures that something fundamental has been removed from their structure. They are called, simply and precisely, Alpha. Nobody knows who they answer to. Nobody knows where they come from. The closest thing to an official acknowledgement of their existence is the complete and absolute refusal of anyone in authority to discuss them when directly asked. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's regent, and the second most powerful individual in the Imperium, does not acknowledge the question when it is raised. The Emperor, who is notably happy to discuss most aspects of his crusade with appropriate parties, has never once mentioned them. They are a gap in the record, a space shaped exactly like a Space Marine Legion where no Space Marine Legion is admitted to be. But this is where the 20th Legion of the first founding began. Not in the light of ceremony, not with the formal recognition of a Primarch found and acclaimed and given command of his force. The Alpha Legion was born in secrecy, raised in secrecy, and spent the early years of the Great Crusade doing things that the rest of the galaxy was not permitted to know about. The very name the designation Alpha carries is, according to some sources, a reference to the final stage of Proto-Legion testing, the Alpha implantation, the first non-experimental introduction of a gene seed pattern to a group of warriors large enough to constitute a genuine fighting force rather than a laboratory sample. But it is also, if you read it in the right register, a statement of identity. We are the first. We were here before you knew we existed. But the formation and maintenance of the 20th Legion is wrapped in contradictions that resist simple resolution. Every other Space Marine Legion, as the Great Crusade progressed, was expanded as rapidly as its gene seed quality and available recruitment sources allowed. Legions that began at a few thousand warriors swelled to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, as the Emperor's wars demanded more bodies and more worlds, provided the young men whose genetics made them viable candidates. This was the logic of the Crusade: expand, conquer, expand further. The cycle of growth and deployment was essentially continuous. The 20th Legion was never allowed to participate in this cycle in the normal way. The records available, fragmentary, as all Alpha Legion records tend to be, show that the gene seed implantation approval for the 20th pattern was never extended to mass recruitment. While other legions grew to staggering numbers, the force that would become the Alpha Legion remained limited to somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 warriors. They were, in formal military terms, a proto-legion rather than a full legion, 1/10 the size of what the Emperor could field in other colors. The reasons for this are debated. but never conclusively established. 3 explanations compete. The first is purely logistical. By the time the 20th Legion's gene seed was ready for wider use, the most suitable genetic candidates from the Terran population had already been claimed by earlier legions. A reported disaster involving tainted recruitment stock had also made the Emperor cautious about drawing from sources that had not been thoroughly vetted. And the vetting process took time that the 20th Legion's continued small size had to accommodate. The second explanation is more concerning. Some hidden flaw or potential instability existed in the 20th pattern gene seed that the Emperor had discovered but not corrected, and which he chose to contain by limiting the size of the force created from it, rather than either solving the problem or destroying the experiment. The third explanation is the most interesting. The 20th Legion was not supposed to be large. It was designed for its role, and its role did not require legions of hundreds of thousands. Its role required a very small number of extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily flexible, extraordinarily deniable operators who could be deployed anywhere and acknowledged nowhere. Alongside the Space Wolves and the Salamanders, the Alpha Legion was grouped in a classification that sources call the Trefoil. 3 legions maintained in deliberate separation from their brother legions, formed for purposes that the Emperor had chosen to keep classified even from most of his closest advisors. Why these 3? The Space Wolves were famous in the oblique language of high imperial politics as the Emperor's executioner, the force sent to do things that could not be done through official channels. The Salamanders were known for their proximity to the Emperor's most personal concerns. At their Primarch Vulcan, deeply aligned with the protection of civilian populations in ways that suggested specific values the Emperor wanted embodied. The Alpha Legion, the third point of the Trefoil, was perhaps the purest expression of the Emperor's understanding that his project could not be completed by noble warfare alone. Some enemies could not be defeated by warriors who stood in the light and declared their intentions. Some threats could only be addressed by a force that had no face, no name, no location, and no history that could be used against it. The earliest Alpha Legion operations were exactly this: targeted strikes against enemies of the nascent Imperium that could not be attributed to any official force. Assassinations of individuals whose deaths would have been diplomatically inconvenient if linked to the Emperor. Abductions of people with knowledge that the Imperium needed, but could not safely acknowledge trying to acquire. The recovery of objects and artifacts whose existence could not be publicly confirmed. All of this conducted with a professional precision that left no traces and invited no inquiries. And all of this before their Primarch was found. The 21st century of the Great Crusade would add to the Alpha Legion something that no amount of training or purpose could manufacture. Twin demigods who embodied every principle their legion had been built around. The discovery of a Primarch was, as a rule, one of the great ceremonial moments of the Great Crusade. The Emperor would locate the scattered demigod who carried the resonance of his genome, and there would be recognition and a kind of profound homecoming that the Primarchs and the Emperor experienced in ways that transcended the merely physical. There would be formal ceremonies. Remembrances would document the meeting. The new Primarch would be introduced to his brothers, to the legions, to the sense of collective purpose that the entire crusade was supposed to embody. Even the most difficult of these discoveries, the violent, chaotic finding of Angron on Nuceria, say, or the terrible isolation in which Conrad Kurz had spent his years on Nostramo, were characterized by a kind of official recognition, a formal acknowledgement that this was one of the Emperor's sons, and that the Emperor's son was now home. The last Primarch to be found was different in ways that his legion would spend 10,000 years making use of. His name was Alfarius, and the circumstances of his finding cannot be stated with any certainty. The account that entered official imperial records describes an encounter between a small Alpha Legion fleet and the flagship of Horus Lupercal, in which unconventional tactics were used to put Horus's ships in a difficult position, and a mysterious warrior boarded the vessel and killed or injured several of Horus's warriors before the War Master himself intervened and recognized the newcomer as a Primarch. It is a story that, even in its official version, requires several substantial suspensions of disbelief and contains inconsistencies that no amount of careful reading can resolve. The deeper truth, the account known within the 20th Legion and shared with virtually no one outside it, is of a magnitude that would reshape understanding of the Great Crusade if it were ever properly confirmed. Alfarius was a twin, not metaphorically, not in some sense of spiritual kinship or shared ideology, a twin in the most literal biological sense. Two Primarchs produced from a single implantation vessel, two demigods with identical physical forms and the same fundamental nature, sharing what multiple sources describe with eerie consistency as one soul inhabiting two bodies. The second Primarch's name was Omegon. He had spent years on a nameless world at the edge of known space, years of isolation, of working out what he was by observation rather than instruction, of surviving on a planet where nothing else was alive. Yet he had found there, waiting as if it had been left for him, an alien weapon of ancient provenance that would follow him into every subsequent battle. He came eventually to the Imperium by stealing a ship from pirates, traveling toward the light of something he had heard called the Emperor. The brothers found each other, and they agreed, in the first of many private councils that would shape the history of the galaxy, that Omegon's existence would remain a secret, not just from the other Primarchs, not just from the other legions, from the Emperor himself, if possible, though the Emperor's capacity for knowing things that others attempted to conceal was legendary. The two Primarchs presented themselves to the galaxy as one. Alfarius, the visible one, yet the commander who spoke at councils and met with brothers and conducted the public business of leading the 20th Legion. Omegon, the hidden one, who directed the Legion's most sensitive operations from positions that officially did not exist. The practical implications of this arrangement were extraordinary. Every hostile intelligence service in the galaxy, and there were many, on both the human and Xeno sides of every conflict the 20th Legion entered, was attempting to understand a Primarch who did not fully exist. The figure they were trying to model and anticipate was half of a whole, presenting only the visible portion of a dual consciousness. Meanwhile, the actual thinking and planning was distributed between two minds that could communicate in ways that transcended the physical separation between them, as that could coordinate without any communications protocol that could be intercepted, that could simultaneously be in two places while each place believed it was seeing the whole picture. This was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a statement of philosophy. The twin Primarchs had built into the foundation of their identity the same principle that defined their entire approach to warfare. Nothing you see is everything there is. The complete picture is always hidden. Your assessment of the situation you are in is incomplete, and that incompleteness is not accidental. The Alpha Legion, under Alfarius and Omegon, developed into something with no real parallel in the history of the Legiones Astartes. Other legions specialized in particular modes of war. The Iron Warriors were siege experts. The Raven Guard favored rapid infiltration and strike warfare. The Thousand Sons relied on psychic power as a primary weapon. The 20th Legion specialized not in a mode of war, but in the destruction of an enemy's ability to understand their own situation. Before the Alpha Legion attacked anywhere, they had already been there, in the shadows, dismantling the target's capacity to respond effectively. They had identified every key individual in the opposing structure and either turned them, replaced them with operatives, or compromised them in ways that would become apparent at the worst possible moment. They had mapped every weakness in the target's communications and supply chains. They had established contact with every disaffected group within the target population, and either fostered those disaffections or created new ones. The final attack, what the 20th Legion called the Harrowing, was not really an attack at all in the conventional sense. It was the revelation that the harrowing had already been happening for months or years, and what was occurring now was simply the moment when its completion became impossible to deny. The target did not fall to the harrowing because the Alpha Legion had superior numbers or superior weapons. though they were perfectly capable in both those areas. The target fell because, by the time the harrowing began, nothing in the target structure was actually reliable anymore. The commanders were giving orders to officers who were no longer loyal. The orders were being transmitted through communications channels that had been quietly modified to pass certain kinds of traffic to the wrong recipients. The defensive positions had been mapped in advance by people inside them. The reinforcements that should have been called were prevented from receiving the call by a single operative in the right communications hub at the right moment. The harrowing was not victory. It was the accounting of a victory that had been accumulating over years. Other Primarchs found this approach deeply uncomfortable, and their discomfort is revealing. Robert Guilliman, whose legion operated on principles of transparently documented efficiency, everything recorded, everything justified, every decision traceable to a reasoned policy, found Alfarius's methods an implicit challenge to the values that the Codex Astartes would eventually enshrine as the gold standard of space marine behavior. As the argument between the two was famous in its time, and is remembered with the clarity that particularly charged encounters tend to retain across the millennia, Guilliman pointed to numbers, his legion's record of compliances, worlds brought into the Imperium's fold, wars won cleanly and quickly, and at documented cost. Alfarius pointed to nothing, because the Alpha Legion's record was either classified or expunged. They parted badly, and the bitterness of the encounter stayed with both parties. Alfarius, who had grown up knowing he was the last found, the youngest, the one who had spent the longest operating without a Primarch's formal guidance, took the criticism of his methods personally in a way that drove him to push the Legion further and harder. Rogel Dawn's criticism was different in character but similar in effect. Dawn believed in things that could be seen and measured and stood behind. Walls, gates, fortified positions, the honest confrontation of strength against strength. The Alpha Legion's reliance on human proxies, on long-running infiltrations, on the manipulation of civilian populations, and the exploitation of social structures that no one had technically asked the 20th Legion to exploit. All of this felt to Dawn like a violation of something fundamental about what warfare was supposed to be. You should be able to look your enemy in the face. You should be able to say, with clarity, "I am the thing that is going to stop you." The Alpha Legion could not say any of these things. They could not say their numbers. They could not say their location. They could not say what they were preparing to do, because the preparation was the whole point, and announcing it was its defeat. What neither Guilliman nor Dawn, nor any of the other Primarchs who found the 20th Legion troubling could have known was that this discomfort was, in a sense, correct. The Alpha Legion was not operating on a different tactical philosophy from its brother legions. It was operating on a different moral philosophy, and that difference would become devastatingly apparent when the galaxy finally broke. On a world called Nurth, 2 years before the Horus Heresy began, a man had been waiting. He had been waiting, in various forms, for over 1,000 years. His name was John Grammaticus, and he was what the more esoteric scholars of the Age of Darkness would later call a perpetual, a human being whose body refused to stay permanently dead, who had been reborn through a mechanism that not even the organization he served fully understood, and who had lived and died and lived again through centuries that would have broken anyone with a conventional relationship to mortality. He was a psyker of extraordinary power. He was also, by any reasonable assessment, deeply tired, in a way that went beyond the physical into something that might be called existential exhaustion. He had been doing this for a very long time. He had been carrying a message that would decide the fate of the galaxy for most of those years. And the organization he served, the Cabal, the ancient Xenos coalition that had spent longer than human civilization watching the ebb and flow of chaos in the galaxy, had told him that his mission was reaching its critical point. The 21st century of the Great Crusade was the window. The Alpha Legion was the vehicle. And the message was one of the most terrible things that any living being has ever been asked to deliver. The Cabal was old. impossibly old by human standards, old in the way that certain stone formations are old, or the way that certain patterns in the warp are old, aged beyond the kind of timescale that human minds can intuitively process. It was a coalition of Xenos species that had been monitoring the galaxy's relationship with chaos for spans of time that made the Great Crusade look like a brief afternoon. In those long centuries of observation, the Cabal had come to what it presented as a mathematical certainty about the future of the galaxy, a one derived from a kind of pattern recognition that operated on timescales no individual human mind could access. They had watched civilizations rise to greatness, encounter chaos in one form or another, and eventually be consumed by it. They had watched species develop counter-strategies, had watched some of those strategies show promise, had watched even promising strategies eventually fail in the face of chaos's fundamental nature as an expression of the psychological substrate of all sentient life. And they had arrived, after what they described as exhaustive analysis, at a conclusion that they believed was the only remaining option. The only way to permanently end chaos was to remove its food source. And the food source chaos relied on most heavily in the current era was humanity. Not because humans were uniquely vulnerable, other species fed the dark gods in their own ways, but because humanity was uniquely numerous, uniquely emotionally intense, and uniquely positioned in the galaxy to generate the kind of psychic weight that sustained the entities of the Imperium at the scale they had achieved. Remove humanity, and the chaos powers would starve. The process would take generations and would be agonizing, but the end result, from the Cabal's perspective, was the only outcome that actually solved the problem, rather than merely delaying it. They were not asking for this directly. They were not suggesting an external genocide. They were saying, with the kind of terrible clarity that only an organization that has watched 1,000 civilizations die can produce, that the war Horus was about to start would end in one of two ways, and those two ways led to two very different futures. They showed these futures to John Grammaticus, and John Grammaticus carried them to Nerth. The first future, the Emperor wins. Horus is defeated. The loyal legions drive the traitors into the Eye of Terror. The Imperium survives, but the Emperor is mortally wounded in the process and is entombed on a device that is part life support machine and part psychic beacon, spending whatever remains of his extraordinary existence sustaining the Astronomicon, the navigational signal that allows his ships to find their way across the stars. The Imperium persists for 10,000 years, increasingly rigid, increasingly fearful, increasingly unable to address the fundamental problem at its core. Its people suffer. Its worlds burn in constant war. The slow erosion of everything the Emperor built grinds forward until, eventually, the accumulated weight of 10 millennia of decay and the ever-increasing pressure from the forces of chaos bring the whole structure down. Chaos wins. It just takes a very long time. The second future, Horus wins. The Emperor dies. Humanity is devastated in a violent paroxysm so total that it might extinguish the species within 2 or 3 generations. But without its primary food source, the chaos entities that have grown fat on human suffering begin to starve. The other species of the galaxy, freed from the shadow of an Imperium that consumed everything around it, have the opportunity to develop, to recover, to face what remains of chaos from positions of greater collective strength. Or the galaxy is not saved. It is wounded terribly. But it survives in a form that has a chance of eventually healing. This was what the Cabal put before Alpharius and Omegon on the world of 42 Hydra Tertius, through the person of an exhausted immortal who had spent 1,000 years building to this moment. The twin Primarchs listened. They asked questions. They were given answers. They took time together that no one outside their own minds can account for. And then they made their decision. They would side with Horus. They would betray the Emperor. They would act against the explicit orders and the explicit safety of the Father who had made them. And they would do it because they believed. or at least they had reasoned themselves into a position where belief felt like the right word, that this was what the Emperor's own purpose required, taken to its ultimate conclusion. The Emperor wanted humanity to survive, and chaos to be defeated. If those two goals could not both be achieved, and the Cabal's vision was correct, then the goal that mattered more was the defeat of chaos, even at the cost of humanity itself. It is worth sitting with how extraordinary this decision was. Not extraordinary because it was treacherous. The galaxy was full of treachery. Extraordinary because it was principled. The Alpha Legion did not betray the Emperor because they hated him, or because chaos had corrupted them, or because Horus had offered them something they wanted badly enough to compromise everything they were. They made a calculated decision, based on information that no one else had access to, that betraying the Emperor was the right thing to do in service of a goal that the Emperor himself would have recognized as his own highest purpose. They were wrong. Or at least, the subsequent 10,000 years of history suggests strongly that they were wrong. But the wrongness came from a genuine attempt to do what they understood to be right, using the only analytical framework available to them at the time. This is what makes the Alpha Legion unlike any other traitor legion. They did not fall. They did not succumb to corruption or pride or the seductive promises of the dark gods. They made a decision, and then, with the absolute commitment that their entire organizational culture was built around, they began executing it. The Horus Heresy, the galactic civil war that consumed the 31st millennium in fire and darkness, and the screaming of 10,000 dying worlds, produced moments of heroism and moments of horror that have not dimmed across 10,000 years of retelling. The world knows the major beats. The drop site massacre at Istvan, where 3 supposedly loyal legions turned their weapons on their brothers in an ambush that annihilated thousands of Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands warriors in a single devastating day. The burning of Prospero, where the Space Wolves destroyed the Thousand Suns homeworld at the Emperor's command. The long siege of Terra, in where the forces of Horus pressed against the walls of the Imperial Palace while the Emperor's finest held every wall and every gate with the knowledge that there was nothing behind them. And Horus himself, dead on the bridge of his flagship, killed by the Emperor, who was in turn destroyed by the encounter. Into this known story, the Alpha Legion inserted itself in ways that are still being analyzed and argued over by historians who devote their careers to unpicking what the 20th Legion was actually doing and why. The behavior of the Alpha Legion during the heresy is, from the outside, completely inexplicable. It does not fit the pattern of any other traitor legion. It does not fit the pattern of any loyalist legion. It fits, loosely and imperfectly, the pattern of an organization that was simultaneously pursuing multiple incompatible objectives and somehow managing to make progress on all of them without definitively committing to any single one. Consider the events in the immediate aftermath of the drop site massacre. The 20th Legion had been present at Istvan, had participated in the ambush that shattered 3 of the Emperor's finest forces. From a Horus-aligned perspective, this was a good day. The war had begun, the traitors had drawn first blood in a way that was strategically decisive, and the Alpha Legion's role in that success should have been celebrated. Instead, elements of the 20th Legion helped the surviving Raven Guard escape. They facilitated the flight of a force that had just been nearly destroyed. A force that, if it had been finished off completely, would have given Horus an even cleaner path to terror. Then, having helped the Raven Guard survive, they followed the survivors home to the moon called Deliverance and began an operation that would rank among the most elaborate acts of sabotage in the heresy's bloody record. The Raven Guard's Primarch Corvus Corax had been given a gift by the Emperor, a sample of undifferentiated Primarch DNA, a genetic treasure of the highest order that was intended to allow the shattered Legion to rebuild its numbers far faster than normal gene seed cultivation would permit. Alpha Legion operatives, surgically altered to be physically indistinguishable from Raven Guard warriors who had died on Istvan's sands, had inserted themselves into the surviving force during the escape. Patient and invisible, they waited as the Raven Guard returned home. As Corax developed his accelerated gene seed protocols, as new warriors began emerging from the process, then they contaminated the product with extracted demonic blood. The warriors produced by the contaminated gene seed were not space marines. They were things that had to be burned. The Raven Guard's hope for rapid recovery was destroyed from the inside by people who had been inside it since before the recovery began. At Kondax, elements of the 20th Legion were following Horus's orders to blockade the White Scar's fleet and prevent them from receiving word of the heresy before Horus was ready to deal with them. But someone, possibly Omegon, possibly an element of the Legion operating on standing orders from before the heresy, possibly an internal faction with its own agenda, also arranged for the message from Rogel Dawn to reach the White Scars. The blockade held long enough to serve Horus's immediate purposes. The message got through anyway. The White Scars made their choice and fought for the Emperor. The Alpha Legion had fulfilled Horus's orders and also undermined them simultaneously in a way that left both sides confused about what had actually happened. This pattern, fulfill the mission, also undermine the mission, leave no clear attribution for either, defines Alpha Legion behavior throughout the heresy in ways that become more, rather than less confusing, the more carefully you examine them. After the drop site massacre, the Cabal reached out again, this time asking the Alpha Legion to move toward Horus's complete victory. Omegon, in his brother's name, wearing his brother's face, carrying his brother's authority, declined. The Cabal had been the source of the decision that set everything in motion, and the 20th Legion was apparently no longer taking their direction. Why? What changed between the meeting on Earth and the middle of the heresy? The Cabal had presented the case as a binary. Either Horus wins quickly, or the long decay unfolds. But the heresy was not unfolding quickly. It was unfolding as a grinding, brutal, years-long conflict that was consuming everything it touched. The conditions for the Cabal's predicted quick victory had not materialized, which meant that either the prediction was wrong, or the conditions for the prediction were not being met, or the prediction was never true to begin with, and the whole thing had been an elaborate manipulation to get the most capable covert warfare organization in the galaxy to work for alien interests at a moment of maximum Imperial vulnerability. The Alpha Legion sat with these questions, apparently, and their answer was to continue doing everything they were already doing, only more so. They would fight the heresy on every front simultaneously. They would help Horus where helping Horus served purposes they could endorse. They would help the Emperor where helping the Emperor served purposes they could also endorse. They would act, always, in service of a goal that only they fully understood, or possibly no longer fully understood themselves. Given that the rationale for the goal had been provided by an organization whose reliability was now in question, it is in this context that the Battle of Pluto must be understood. In the late stages of the Horus heresy, as the traitor legions gathered their full strength for the assault on Terra, the Alpha Legion received a mission from the War Master Horus that was, in its way, a perfect crystallization of everything they had ever been. They were to go ahead, to prepare the Sol system for what was coming, to infiltrate the most heavily defended position in the history of human civilization and create conditions for the assault that would follow. What Alfarius did with this mission still stands as one of the most audacious military operations in the heresy's long record of audacious military operations. Well, he took his entire fleet, every ship, every space marine, every crew member, and put them into stasis. He powered everything down to the minimum necessary to sustain life in the containers. He adjusted course and speed so that the fleet would drift, unpowered, at the most minimal possible thermal signature, toward the Sol system. And then he waited. For a year. An entire standard year of silent, cold drift through the outer void, invisible against the background of space, while the most sophisticated sensor network ever constructed by humanity scanned the approaches to humanity's home system and found nothing. They had been inside the system for a year before the Imperial Fists noticed.
Okay, I have to be honest with you for a second, because this is the part where I genuinely get a little frustrated with how the Alpha Legion gets talked about in the community. Most people, when they argue about the Alpha Legion, get caught up in the loyalist versus traitor debate, like it's a sport team rivalry. Team Alpharius is still loyal versus Team they were always just traitors, and I think both of those camps are missing what makes the 20th Legion actually interesting, which is that they are the only faction in the entire setting that forces you to sit with genuine uncertainty and not resolve it. Every other faction in 40k has an answer, even the ambiguous ones. The Alpha Legion doesn't, and I think Games Workshop, for all the things you can say about their lore decisions, got that exactly right. Because an Alpha Legion with a clean answer would be lesser thing than an Alpha Legion without one. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
By that point, Alpha Legion operatives had already penetrated the Imperial Palace, the most secure location in the galaxy, protected by the full strength of the Imperial Fists and the Legio Custodes, and every other defensive resource that Rogel Dawn could bring to bear on the problem of keeping the Emperor safe. The Alpha Legion was inside it. They found the Investory, the chamber where statues of all 20 Primarchs had been erected to commemorate the Great Crusade's greatest commanders. They destroyed every statue in the chamber except 2. They left standing the statue of Rogel Dawn as a pointed message, "We were here and you never knew." And they left standing the statue of Alpharius as a companion message that is harder to read but possibly more significant. "We are still here. We are still your problem, and we are standing next to you, right now, in the same room." Then Alpharius went to Pluto. The details of what happened on the fortress moon of Hydra are given in the novel dedicated to the period, and they are worth understanding carefully because the Battle of Pluto is, in many ways, the pivot point around which the entire subsequent history of the Alpha Legion turns. Alpharius arranged himself so that Rogel Dawn would have to face him personally. He prepared his best warriors, the Lernian Terminators, the Headhunters, the absolute elite of the 20th Legion. And when the confrontation came, he did something that was either deeply sincere or an extraordinary piece of psychological warfare, or possibly both simultaneously. He tried to talk. He told Dawn that he had come to teach him how to win, that Dawn did not understand what he was fighting for, that only Alpharius knew the real truth of this conflict, and that he did not fight for Horus, that he fought for Dawn. Dawn did not engage with this. Dawn fought. The combat that followed was brutal and extended. Alpharius was an extraordinary warrior. Contemporary assessments rated his tactical and strategic abilities alongside Perturabos and Guilliman's, which is to say among the finest that had ever existed. And in close combat, he was quick, unpredictable, and relentless. He wounded Dawn repeatedly, but Dawn was the Praetorian, built for exactly this kind of desperate, grinding endurance. And when Alpharius finally moved to deliver what should have been the killing blow with the pale spear, Dawn sacrificed his own arm to trap the weapon. Pinned, Alpharius could not escape what followed. Dawn took his chainblade Storm's Teeth and used it with terminal finality. Alpharius died. Omegon felt it. And this is one of the most significant confirmed details in the entire Alpha Legion story. There is no ambiguity here. Omegon felt his brother's death as a physical and psychic rupture, a tearing away of something that had been part of him since before he could remember. The soul that had been shared between 2 bodies became half of what it had been. The plan that had been conceived for 2 minds was now running on one. Omegon became Alpharius. He took the name, assumed the role, and continued leading the 20th Legion as though nothing irreversible had happened. He was good enough at the pretense that most of the galaxy continued to believe Alpharius had simply survived another apparently fatal encounter. The Alpha Legion fleet withdrew from Pluto and the heresy continued. And eventually, Horus died, and the Emperor was interred, and the Great Scouring began, and the traitor legions were driven back, and the Imperium spent the next millennium trying to rebuild what had been shattered. And then there was Escrador. After the heresy, the man now calling himself Alpharius, who was Omegon, who was alone for the first time, who was following a plan designed for both of them, with only half the mind it had been designed for, moved his legion east toward the Ultramarines. The rivalry between Alfarius and Guilliman had never resolved. Alfarius had believed Guilliman hated him. He had organized his existence around proving the Ultramarines wrong. And even in death, even with Omegon wearing his name and his face and his armor, that rivalry apparently continued. On the world of Escrador, as the man called Alfarius was killed again. The account of this battle comes from a single source, a report by an inquisitor named Craven. In that report, an Ultramarine strike force surprised the Alpha Legion's headquarters. The two forces' commanders met in personal combat, and Alfarius died. The Alpha Legion then regrouped, fought back, and drove the Ultramarines from the planet. The battle was a tactical victory for the 20th Legion and a strategic nothing, because what it cost them was the Primarch, who had been their compass. After writing this report, Inquisitor Craven disappeared. The Ultramarines have no records of the engagement. The single source for this pivotal event in the Alpha Legion's history is a man who ceased to exist shortly after producing it, and whose records have never been found. Is Omegon dead? Is the information about Escrador accurate? Was the figure Guilliman killed the actual Primarch, or a specially conditioned operative trained to fight as a Primarch? A deception engineered specifically to let Omegon disappear from the galaxy's attention completely? Characters within current Alpha Legion stories have sharply different views. Occam the Untrue, operating in the 42nd Millennium, believes Omegon is alive and has been following what appears to be a trail that leads to Necron archives. He did not find what he hoped to find. Others insist that Omegon died on Escrador. The Alpha Legion itself has never confirmed either account, which is, of course, exactly what you would expect the Alpha Legion to do. The honest answer, the only honest answer, is that nobody knows. And after 10,000 years, that nobody knowing is probably the point. Now, here is the thing about the Alpha Legion that separates them from every other traitor organization in the galaxy, the thing that makes the following 10,000 years of their history possible, the thing that explains why a force that has officially been declared eradicated 3 times continues to conduct sophisticated operations in the current era. Every other traitor legion retreated to the Eye of Terror. This seems like a small detail until you understand what the Eye of Terror does to things that spend time inside it. The Eye is a massive, permanent warp rift, a place where the membrane between the material universe and the immaterium has been torn away completely, leaving a region of space where the rules of physics are merely suggestions and the passage of time is a creative interpretation rather than a fixed quantity. Inside the Eye, a space marine who was a relatively ordinary warrior at the time of the heresy might have experienced subjectively a few decades while 10,000 years passed outside. Or he might have experienced 1,000,000 years of subjective time in a single standard day. The Eye is not consistent. It is not safe. It is, in the most fundamental sense, a place that is corrosive to everything that enters it, including the bodies, the minds, and the gene seed of space marines. The traitor legions that retreated to the Eye of Terror spent millennia inside an environment that accelerated their corruption and degraded their biological consistency. The Death Guard, already committed to Nurgle's philosophy of entropy, rotted in ways that changed their fundamental nature. The World Eaters, already berserkers before the heresy, became something that had almost abandoned the concept of strategic thought entirely in favor of the simple, consuming desire to kill. The Emperor's children, seeking sensation in the Eye's impossible landscape, found things to sense that no human nervous system was designed to process. And those discoveries left marks on their sanity that 10,000 years have not removed. The Thousand Sons rebuilt their shattered legion through sorcery that preserved their bodies, but left the question of what remained inside those bodies deeply uncertain. Even the Black Legion, arguably the most functional of the Eye's permanent residents, bears the marks of 10,000 years of warp exposure in every aspect of its culture and organization. Most of the traitor legion's gene seed has been degraded to the point where producing new Space Marines is a significant challenge. The chaos mutations that warp Heresy-era veterans continue in their descendants. The Eye of Terror does not merely preserve the traitors at the cost of their humanity, it compounds the cost with every passing year. The legions that went into the Eye are, in important senses, getting worse over time. The Alpha Legion chose differently. After the events at Escrador, after whatever happened there, whoever died there, whatever it meant for the Legion's leadership and direction, the 20th Legion fragmented, deliberately, the structure that had held them together during the heresy, yet the extraordinary unity of purpose that had allowed 10,000 warriors to function as a single instrument across star systems was intentionally dissolved into a web of independent cells. Small autonomous groups of warriors set up hidden bases in asteroid fields, inside drifting space hulks, on barren and uninhabited worlds that nobody would have reason to visit. They cut their formal ties to any central authority and began operating on standing mission parameters that had been established before the fragmentation, broad objectives that individual cells could pursue without the need for ongoing direction from a central commander who might not be reachable or might not exist. By not living in the Eye of Terror, by spending their 10,000 years operating primarily in real space in the material universe, inside the Imperium's own territory, the Alpha Legion avoided the physical and psychological degradation that has hollowed out their fellow traitor legions. Their gene seed, maintained outside the Eye's corrupting influence, has remained functional. The Alpha Legion continues to make new Space Marines. It continues to replace its losses. Individual members of the 21st century still fight in the 42nd Millennium, not as warp-twisted monsters, but as Space Marines who have simply been running the same operation for a very, very long time. The experience that has accumulated in those 10,000 years of constant activity, of ongoing refinement of methods and approaches and networks and resources, is unlike anything any other military organization in the galaxy possesses. When a Harrowmaster of the Alpha Legion plans an operation in the current era, they are drawing on a database of methods and context that was being built before most of the Loyalist Space Marine chapters they are targeting existed. When an Alpha Legion operative positions themselves within an Imperial institution, they are potentially using a network of contacts and conditioned agents that has been in place for decades or centuries before the current leadership of that institution was born. The Inquisition has been trying to catalogue Alpha Legion methods since the 32nd Millennium, and their catalogue grows with every decade. The methods grow faster. This is the central horror of the Alpha Legion from an Imperial perspective. It is not a horror of scale. They are not the largest force in the galaxy. It is not a horror of power. They do not have the raw destructive capability of the Black Legion or the biological weapon of civilization destruction that the Tyranids represent. It is a horror of patience, of depth, of the accumulation of capability over timescales that human institutions find it genuinely difficult to conceptualize. The Alpha Legion has been building toward things that are happening now for decades or centuries or, in some cases, millennia. The plan that is being executed in the 42nd Millennium may have been designed in the 38th. The operative who takes a critical position in an Imperial institution this year may have been the grandfather of the person who first established the contact that made that position accessible. The bomb is already inside. It has been inside for a long time, and it is waiting for a trigger that has not yet been sent. The mechanics of how the Alpha Legion has sustained itself across 10 millennia are worth examining in detail, because understanding the system explains both why it is so difficult to counter and why, in certain deep and uncomfortable ways, it is almost elegant. The first mechanism is the human operative network, and it is the foundation on which everything else is built. Long before any Alpha Legion force moves openly in any region of the galaxy, they have spent years, often decades, constructing a web of human agents embedded in every layer of that region's institutions. These operatives are not, in most cases, people who understand what they are working for. Many have been cultivated gradually through a series of engineered relationships and apparent coincidences, until their loyalty to an organization they might not even be able to name is practically absolute. Some have undergone psychohypnotic conditioning that makes them structurally unable to betray certain information, even under interrogation techniques that would break a space marine. Some have been conditioned to believe they are working for entirely different organizations: Imperial intelligence services, legitimate trade concerns, devotional movements within the ecclesiarchy, and have no idea that the hand directing their small contributions belongs to the 20th Legion. These operatives can be anyone: mid-level administratum clerks who can redirect supply convoys and lose specific cargo manifests, security staff in the households of planetary governors who can ensure certain doors are open at certain times, Sholem teachers who shape the psychology of children who will one day grow into people with influence, Medici staff who have access to records that reveal the physical and psychological vulnerabilities of people the Alpha Legion has designated as targets or potential recruits. The network is never the same in any two regions because it is tailored to the specific institutional structure of each region, and it is maintained over periods of time that outlast the individuals who built it. When an operative dies, their contacts pass to the next person designated to maintain them. The network does not depend on any single link. It depends on the structure, and the structure has been refined for 10,000 years. The second mechanism is the cult network, which the Inquisition is most commonly aware of and most commonly fights against without fully understanding. The Alpha Legion's extraordinary skill at seeding and cultivating chaos cults is famous, and the standard inquisitorial interpretation of these cults as recruitment tools for heretical rebellion is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Alpha Legion cults serve multiple simultaneous purposes. They create pools of dedicated human fighters who can be triggered at precisely the right moment to generate maximum disruption for minimum expenditure of Space Marine resources. They provide cover for Alpha Legion operatives moving through a region who can pose as cult leaders or cult members or cult opponents, depending on what the mission requires. They generate ongoing intelligence about how local imperial institutions respond to chaos-adjacent activity, which is information of enormous tactical value. They test the strength and location of weaknesses in imperial authority structures, and they function as long-term conditioning tools for populations that may have roles to play in operations that have not yet entered their active phase. The most devastating example of this approach, in the recorded history of the Alpha Legion's actions, is the destruction of the Emperor's Swords Space Marine chapter. This was not a quick operation. It was not a battle, or an engagement, or even a campaign in the conventional sense. It was a project that ran for over 12 generations, spanning more than 3 centuries, and during which time the Emperor's Sword served the Imperium faithfully and without any suspicion that something was deeply wrong. Alpha Legion agents had infiltrated the hive slums of the chapter's homeworld, where the chapter conducted its recruitment drives. Using the networks of gangs and religious movements that naturally develop in hive environments, they began conditioning children, very young children, children who had not yet become aspirants, children who would not become aspirants for years, with psychological triggers embedded in imagery and language and ritual practices that appeared, to everyone involved, to be normal elements of their subculture. Most of these children never made it to the chapter's selection process, but some did. And some of those who passed the selection process were successful enough in their training and augmentation to become Space Marines. 3 centuries later, when the Alpha Legion chose to act, they had warriors inside the Emperor's Swords who had been carrying buried commands since childhood. When the attack came, it combined external assault with internal psychological weaponry, hypnotic and psychic triggers that released the dormant conditioning in the compromised Space Marines. Dazed and shattered, those warriors turned on their brothers. The chapter destroyed itself from within in a matter of hours. What survived, the Alpha Legion killed or recruited. The homeworld was burned. The chapter's gene seed was stolen. 3 centuries of patient preparation, while culminating in the complete destruction of a Space Marine chapter that never knew it had been penetrated. This is the Alpha Legion's most important tactical principle in practical application. The most effective attack is the one your enemy delivered to themselves, because they could not see the mechanism by which they were doing it. The third mechanism is the recruitment system, which is perhaps the most alarming from the perspective of anyone who would like the Alpha Legion to eventually run out of Space Marines. Inquisitor Craven, in his report before his disappearance, described how the 20th Legion acquires new members. They do not recruit from their homeworld, because they have no homeworld. They do not need to raid the Eye of Terror's gene banks, because their gene seed has not degraded to the point of unreliability. If they recruit entirely within Imperial territory, using the same networks of operatives and conditioning tools that serve their other purposes, identifying genetically suitable candidates, and channeling them toward clandestine gene seed implantation facilities that the Inquisition has never fully located or destroyed. These facilities exist inside the Imperium itself, in asteroid belts, in the maintenance levels of massive orbital stations, in converted sections of space hulks that only certain people know how to navigate, in locations that move before anyone finds them, and have already moved again before anyone finds their previous location. The Alpha Legion makes new Space Marines in the Imperium's own shadow, using the Imperium's own population. As the process is slower and more limited than the structured recruitment that Loyalist chapters conduct, but it is consistent, it replaces losses, and it has been doing so for 10,000 years. The gene seed thus produced and implanted is clean. The gene seed of the Alpha Legion is thought to be the least warp-corrupted of any traitor Legion's stock, because it has spent those 10,000 years primarily outside the Eye of Terror's influence. The warriors it produces are, biologically, Space Marines in the fullest sense of that word, not chaos-mutated approximations, not warp-degraded remnants of what the Astartes were supposed to be. Space Marines, who happen to serve purposes that the Imperium has never sanctioned and probably never will. The fourth mechanism is organizational flexibility. The Alpha Legion does not fight the same way twice, across the same region, against the same target type. It has no fixed doctrine in the rigid sense that the Codex Astartes imposes on Loyalist chapters. Its Harrow Masters, the senior commanders who lead individual cells and warbands, are given broad mission objectives and the authority to pursue them by whatever methods they judge most effective. The doctrine they do have is about approach rather than execution. Understand the target completely before engaging it. Build the conditions for success before the combat begins. Strike from positions that the target did not know were positions until it was too late. And build the action so that each step flows naturally from the preparation that preceded it. The specific weapons, the specific timing, and the specific mix of combat and infiltration and cult activity, these are left to the Harrow Master's judgment, because the Harrow Master knows the local situation and central direction does not. This means that the Alpha Legion cannot be countered by developing a counter to their standard tactics, because they do not have standard tactics in the sense that other forces do. You can develop countermeasures to a Blood Angel's assault formation. You can study the Iron Warrior's siege methodology and build defenses that exploit its weaknesses. The Alpha Legion looks at what you have built to counter them and uses it as information about the environment they are operating in. If you build a particular kind of defensive sensor network in response to a previous infiltration, the next infiltration will already have taken that network into account, and its operators will be inside it before it activates. Hydra Dominatus, cut off one head. The 10,000 years between the end of the Horus Heresy and the current 42nd Millennium era have been, from the Alpha Legion's perspective, a long operational pause punctuated by periodic active phases. The broad strokes of their history during this period include a number of significant and documented incidents alongside vast stretches of activity that either left no recoverable record or produced records that the 20th Legion subsequently ensured were no longer available. The first official eradication declaration came in the 31st millennium, the very century that the heresy ended, and a period during which the Imperium was still raw from everything that had happened, and the Great Scouring was driving the traitor legions back toward the Eye of Terror. The declaration reflected genuine imperial optimism about having solved the problem. The Alpha Legion, having deliberately fragmented after whatever happened at Escrador, had reduced their observable presence dramatically. With no large formations moving through space, with no obvious bases to attack, the Inquisition and the High Lords could look at the absence of evidence and interpret it as evidence of absence. The Alpha Legion then demonstrated, through a series of precisely timed and devastatingly effective operations conducted over the following decades, that the declaration was wishful thinking. The Second Eradication Declaration, in the 32nd millennium, reflected somewhat more weary imperial optimism. The Third, in the 39th millennium, reflected what might be characterized as a nearly desperate need on the part of the High Lords to have the problem not exist, and was issued in circumstances that suggest the intelligence supporting it was either incomplete or itself compromised. Between and around these declarations, the 20th Legion's activity continued. In the 34th millennium, agents of the Alpha Legion began the long conditioning project that would eventually destroy the Emperor's Swords Chapter 3 centuries later. In the 37th millennium, a carefully orchestrated cult uprising on Cephian 4 was disrupted by the Black Templars, resulting in one of the few documented cases of an Alpha Legion operation being visibly stopped before reaching its conclusion, which should perhaps be taken as evidence for how rarely this happens, rather than as evidence that it is possible. In the 40th millennium, the events known collectively as the Siege of Vrax drew Alpha Legion involvement of a character that the Inquisition debated for decades afterward. Were they supporting the heretics who had taken Vrax? Or were they, as some evidence suggested, deliberately escalating the siege to force the Imperium to commit the kind of military resources that would eventually bring it to a conclusion? Did they want Vrax to fall, or did they want the Imperium to destroy it? Were those the same goal, achieved by opposite means? The Alpha Legion did not answer these questions. The Alpha Legion never answers questions. In the current era, the 42nd millennium with its great rift tearing the galaxy apart, the return of Robert Guilliman and the forces of the Indomitus Crusade, and the terrible new pressures that the Cicatrix Maledictum has placed on every faction that has to navigate a galaxy now physically divided, the Alpha Legion is present and active. The Ghost Legion coalition under Solomon Akura represents something new in the post-heresy history of the 20th Legion, a deliberate attempt at reunification, or at least coordination, on a scale not attempted since the heresy itself. 8 separate warbands, operating under coordinated command with a shared strategic objective, working together toward a goal that intelligence services describe as seriously threatening imperial rule, without being able to specify further because the specific threat is not fully legible to them yet. The Pale Spear, the alien weapon that killed one Primarch, that was nearly used to kill another, that has been a fragment of Alpha Legion identity since before the heresy, is in Solomon Akura's hands. Partially. He has most of it. The rest is apparently still being sought. Why is a 10,000-year-old piece of alien technology important enough for a Harrowmaster to build a coalition of 8 warbands around recovering it? What does the Pale Spear mean to the Alpha Legion in the current era? Is it simply a powerful weapon, a relic of their greatest leaders, a symbol of the claim to authority that having it represents? Or does it do something specific that has been guiding its recovery as a deliberate priority for all this time? And then there is the beacon of Tsadreka, in Kassa's hands, trusted to him by Saint Celestine, keeping the Astronomicon functioning in regions of the Imperium Nihilus, where it otherwise could not reach. A traitor space marine, leader of a warband of warriors who have been fighting for 10,000 years, holding in his possession one of the most important objects in the current Imperium's survival, because a woman who is the living embodiment of the Emperor's will chose to give it to him. This fact alone would be enough to make any serious Imperial theologian require a quiet lie-down and several strong beverages. It does not fit the narrative of the Alpha Legion as simple traitors. It fits the narrative of something much more complicated. So, what is the Alpha Legion? The question has been asked for 10,000 years. It has driven inquisitors to obsession. It has divided the most learned scholars of the heresy period. It has generated a body of analysis and counter-analysis that, if printed and stacked, would constitute a significant geographical feature on most inhabited worlds. And the answer, the honest, complete answer, is that we do not know. What we can say is what the Alpha Legion is not. They are not simply Chaos Space Marines in the mold of the World Eaters or the Death Guard. Those legions made a clear choice. They gave themselves to their gods, accepted the transformation that service entailed, and pursued the goals of their patron deities with the clarity that complete theological commitment provides. The Alpha Legion has never done this. Individual warbands drift in this direction over time. Fyrevius Karen's almost comically devoted turn toward Khorne is perhaps the most extreme example, and is generally treated within the broader Alpha Legion tradition as a failure mode rather than an aspiration. But the organization as a whole has maintained something rarer than it might appear: the freedom to pursue its own objectives without being subject to divine direction. They are not the Long War fighters in the way Abaddon conceives of the Long War. The Black Legion's goal is the conquest of the Imperium and the completion of what Horus began. That is its stated purpose. And Abaddon has been pursuing it with the tenacity of someone who has been angry about the same thing for 10,000 years. The Alpha Legion's relationship to the Long War is more ambiguous. They participate in it when participation serves their purposes. They undermine their nominal allies when that also serves their purposes. They fight the Imperium in ways that advance goals the Imperium cannot fully perceive, and they occasionally do things that advance the Imperium's survival in ways that make the conceptual category of traitor legion feel insufficient. They are not simply an intelligence and subversion organization that has outlasted its original purpose. The purpose is still there. What changed is the certainty about what the purpose is in service of. It's the original decision, to side with Horus because the Cabal's vision suggested this would serve the greater good, has been invalidated by subsequent events in the sense that Horus did not win and the galaxy did not follow the Cabal's predicted path. But the decision was never really about Horus. It was about the nature of chaos and the question of whether there was a way to defeat it that the Imperium had not been shown. That question has not been answered. It is more urgent than ever in an era when the warp itself has torn the galaxy physically in two. The most compelling reading of the Alpha Legion's current behavior, the one that is most consistent with everything they have done across 10,000 years, is that they are still trying to answer that question, still pursuing, but by means that have evolved dramatically across the millennia, the goal that was presented to them on Earth. Not the specific goal of ensuring Horus's victory, which was a means toward an end rather than an end in itself. The actual end, finding the path that leads to the permanent defeat of chaos, and doing it in the way they have always done things, from inside the problem, with information that nobody else has, using methods that nobody else would think to use, advancing toward a conclusion that may not become visible until after it has been achieved. The Alpha Legion has been declared destroyed 3 times. It has not been destroyed. It has been infiltrated, exposed, harried, bombed, psychically assaulted, legally erased from the record, officially expunged from history, declared heresy, declared abomination, declared non-existent, and declared dead on 3 separate formal occasions. And in the 42nd millennium, right now, today, it is still fighting. Not because it has been unable to stop, because it has chosen not to. Hydra dominatus. The Hydra regrows its heads. The Legion does not end because you cannot end it, because ending requires there to be a thing that can be definitively killed, and the Alpha Legion has spent 10,000 years ensuring that there is no such thing. There are cells, there are warbands, there are individual warriors with individual purposes and individual methods and individual levels of fidelity to whatever the original purpose was. There are operatives in positions you would not believe, advancing goals you would not recognize. There is, possibly, a Primarch somewhere, planning something on a timescale that your institutional memory does not extend far enough to encompass. They are the Legion nobody knows is still fighting. They have always been the Legion nobody knows is still fighting. And somewhere, in the dark between stars, someone is wearing a piece of blue-green armor that shifts color with the light. Someone is planning something that will take decades to mature. Someone is placing a human operative in a position that will not become relevant for 20 years, on a world that the Inquisition is currently satisfied is clean. I am Alfarius. So is everyone around you. Thank you for spending this much time with what is one of the most layered and fascinating factions in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. But the Alpha Legion rewards this kind of deep attention more than almost any other force in the setting, because the more carefully you look at them, the more there is to find. And the more you find, the more questions open up that cannot be answered with any certainty. That's the design. That was always the design. If this kind of in-depth lore exploration is what you come to this channel for, please subscribe, because this is what Q on 40K is built around. Drop a comment telling me what you believe the Alpha Legion is truly fighting for in the current era. I genuinely want to know what this community thinks about a question that the lore has never definitively answered, and honestly may never answer. And if this video helped you understand the 20th Legion in a new way, and hit the like button to help other people who would enjoy it find it. I'll see you in the next one. Hydra Dominatus. Expansion, the architecture of deception, how the Alpha Legion actually works. Let us spend some time sitting inside the Alpha Legion's operational philosophy, because this is the part that most accounts gloss over in favor of the more dramatic moments, the Primarch deaths, the great battles, the spectacular betrayals. The truly remarkable thing about the 20th Legion is not any single act they have committed across 10,000 years. It is the system that allows them to keep committing acts across 10,000 years without running out of the resources, the people, the organizational coherence, or the will to continue. Every Space Marine Legion, and every successor chapter that came after the heresy, operates according to some version of a war doctrine. The Dark Angels are relentless hunters of a specific kind of quarry, and every aspect of their organization, from their chapter hierarchy to their tactical preferences, reflects that purpose. The Space Wolves fight with an aggressive, pack-driven intensity that their gene seed and their culture reinforce in every recruit. The Blood Angels balance their extraordinary physical gifts and genuine compassion against the red thirst and the black rage that haunt their lineage, and their approach to war is shaped by that tension between what they are at their best and what they might become at their worst. Each chapter has a character, a flavor, a set of priorities that makes them recognizable even when operating in theaters very different from their usual ones. The Alpha Legion's doctrine, one if you can call it that, operates on a completely different level of abstraction. It is not a doctrine about how to fight, it is a doctrine about how to understand. The question that every Alpha Legion plan begins with is not, what force do we need to destroy this target? It is, what does this target believe about its own situation? Because the answer to the second question contains, in virtually every case, the complete map of the target's vulnerabilities. What a commander believes about his supply situation tells you where to cut the supplies. What a planet's governor believes about his security staff tells you which member of that staff the governor trusts most completely, and which one is therefore the most valuable to compromise, because the most trusted person's betrayal will cause the most damage. So what a Space Marine chapter believes about the nature of the threat in its operating region tells you what that chapter is not watching for. This is the principle that Alfarius articulated in the pre-heresy era, and that the Alpha Legion has been refining across 10 millennia. The most powerful weapon is the gap between what an enemy believes to be true and what is actually true. If you can control that gap, If you can decide what your enemy believes and feed that belief the information it needs to sustain itself while actually advancing your own purposes, then you do not need to fight them at all. You simply need to wait until their own actions, based on their own false understanding, produce the outcome you wanted. The practical implementation of this principle requires something that almost no other military organization in the galaxy has: patience, organized into an institutional structure that can sustain plans across timescales that outlast individual human lifetimes. The Alpha Legion solves this problem through what might be called a doctrine of distributed inheritance. Individual operatives, cells, and warbands operate with enough independence to survive the loss of any central coordination. But they also maintain enough alignment with broader mission parameters that the overall plan continues advancing, even when specific elements of it are disrupted or destroyed. The mission parameters themselves are designed to be self-evident to anyone who understands the Alpha Legion's core philosophy, not because they are written down anywhere that can be captured, but because any sufficiently senior member of the 20th Legion will arrive at the same strategic assessment from first principles if given the same information about the current situation. This is described in certain inquisitorial assessments that the Ordo Hereticus is not particularly happy to see circulating even within its own ranks, as possibly the most dangerous aspect of the Alpha Legion. You cannot destroy their plan by killing their planner, because the plan is not in the planner's head. It is in the analysis that any competent Alpha Legion Harrowmaster would produce when shown the current state of the board. Kill one Harrowmaster and the cell assigns another, who reviews the situation and continues the plan, because anyone who has been trained to Alpha Legion standards and given the relevant information will arrive at more or less the same strategic conclusions. The plan is not a document. It is a shared understanding of what success looks like and how to move toward it from wherever you currently are. The operational consequence of this is that the Alpha Legion effectively cannot be decapitated. Every other military organization of note has a point of failure that can be targeted. The Black Legion is shaped by Abaddon's personal vision and kept coherent by his personal authority. Kill Abaddon, and the question of what happens to the Black Legion is genuinely uncertain. But the Thousand Suns are an expression of Magnus's will and Magnus's sorcery. How much of the Thousand Suns' specific character survives? Magnus's absence is unclear. The Tau ethereal caste maintains the cohesion of a civilization that would otherwise fragment into competing castes and ideologies. Remove the ethereals, and the Tau Empire's future becomes unpredictable. Every faction has its structural weakness, the place where a sufficiently powerful blow lands and everything changes. The Alpha Legion was designed without one. This was intentional. Alpharius and Omegan had spent their entire pre-Primarch existence in situations where they were the only authority, and the loss of either of them would have been catastrophic for whatever mission they were running. They built a legion that would not repeat that vulnerability. The command structure of the 20th Legion is horizontal rather than vertical, distributed rather than concentrated. Every cell has enough information to run its own operations, and enough connection to the broader framework to stay aligned with the larger plan. Every Harrowmaster has enough authority to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for direction from above. The result is an organization that is extraordinarily difficult to disrupt at the operational level and nearly impossible to destroy at the strategic level, because destroying it strategically would require somehow identifying and simultaneously eliminating every cell, every operative, every conditioned human agent, and on every thread of connection between them, a task that would require perfect intelligence about an organization whose defining characteristic is that it prevents you from having perfect intelligence about it. The Inquisition has spent 10,000 years being frustrated by this. The frustration is warranted. The problem is not lack of effort or lack of capability. The problem is structural. The Alpha Legion was designed by Primarchs with millennia of experience in covert operations, specifically to resist exactly the kind of counterintelligence effort that the Inquisition has been applying to it. You cannot solve the Alpha Legion problem with more investigators. because investigators can only investigate what exists in a form that can be investigated. Yes, the Alpha Legion ensures that most of what they do does not exist in that form until it is too late for investigation to help. Expansion. The Legion's internal factions. Not one thing, but many. One of the most common misconceptions about the Alpha Legion, even among people who know their history reasonably well, is that it functions as a unified organization working toward a single coherent goal. This was arguably true during the Great Crusade era, when Alpharius and Omegon's dual authority kept the Legion aligned around the strategic vision they shared. It was arguably still true during the heresy itself, though the cracks were already showing. The evidence of elements acting to help the Emperor's side while the official policy was to support Horus suggests that even then, but the vision was not perfectly shared across every cell and every warrior. In the 10,000 years since, whatever unity existed has substantially fragmented. Not because the Legion dissolved, clearly it has not dissolved, but because 10,000 years of independent operation by autonomous cells without any central authority strong enough to override local judgment will inevitably produce divergence. Cells in different parts of the galaxy, operating under different conditions, against different enemies, with different resources, develop different understandings of what the mission requires and different approaches to achieving it. Some of these understandings are compatible with each other, some are not. What we can observe in the current era suggests several broad currents within what was once the 20th Legion, though it is important to note that these are not formal factions with names and leadership structures. They are tendencies, orientations, sets of assumptions that different elements of the Legion appear to share and that influence how they operate. The first current is what might be called the true inheritors, cells and warbands that operate as closely as possible to the original vision of Alpharius and Omegon. They use subterfuge and long-term conditioning as their primary weapons. They avoid direct conflict with major Imperial forces wherever possible, not because they cannot fight, but because fighting is expensive and subtlety is cheaper. They maintain the most sophisticated operative networks. They recruit cautiously and carefully, prioritizing quality over quantity and the long-term stability of their networks over short-term gains. They tend to see themselves as executing a plan that is still running from the original mission parameters established before the heresy, with adaptations for the changed circumstances of the current era. Solomon Okura and his Ghost Legion coalition may represent an attempt to bring this current back to something approaching the coherence it had during the heresy, to reunify enough of the true inheritor cells under coordinated command to pursue goals that require more than any single warband can achieve. The second current is the pragmatists. These are cells and warbands that have retained the Alpha Legion's tactical toolkit, the methods of infiltration, subversion, and long-running preparation, but have largely divorced those methods from the original ideological framework. They fight because fighting is what they know how to do, and they do it in the most effective way available to them, which happens to be the Alpha Legion way. They may take contracts, ally with other Chaos forces when it is convenient, pursue local objectives without much concern for whether those objectives connect to any broader strategic picture. They are functionally highly sophisticated mercenary operators who happen to have been Space Marines for 10,000 years and have developed a professional culture around the methods of their original Legion. They are dangerous and effective, but they are not really pursuing anything beyond their own continuation and the completion of whatever specific mission they are currently engaged in. The third current is the one that the Inquisition finds most theoretically troubling, though also the most difficult to confirm: the Loyalists, or at least the elements of the Alpha Legion that have come over 10,000 years of watching the Imperium grind toward destruction, to the conclusion that the Cabal was wrong and the Emperor's victory was correct, and that the proper purpose of the Alpha Legion now is to serve the Emperor's survival from a position that no official Imperial organ can endorse. These elements exist. Occam the Untrue is the most prominent example in current canon, though he is careful about how he articulates his position. Was the case of Kassar and the beacon of Sadreka, trusted to him by a living saint, suggests that something about at least some elements of the 20th Legion is recognizable to entities with access to the Emperor's will as something worth preserving and trusting, despite 10,000 years of formal heresy. The argument that certain Alpha Legionnaires make, and Occam makes this argument explicitly, or close enough to explicitly that it can be understood, is that their legion has always served the Emperor's purpose, just never through means the Emperor could acknowledge. The Emperor's purpose was the survival of humanity and the defeat of chaos. That purpose is not served by a loyal Space Marine chapter that follows the Codex Astartes and fights whatever enemy is placed in front of it. That purpose is served by an organization that can penetrate the structures that threaten the Imperium from within, that can engage threats too subtle and too deeply embedded for conventional military force to address, that can carry out actions in the long-term interest of humanity's survival that would be unacceptable if any official authority had to endorse them. The Alpha Legion, in this reading, is not a traitor organization that has been gradually rehabilitating itself. It is the organization it was always meant to be, still operating, still doing the Emperor's necessary and deniable work. The heresy was the method, not the purpose. The purpose remains. In whether this argument is a genuine philosophical position or an elaborate self-justification for 10,000 years of actions that did not actually serve the Emperor's purpose, is a question that the Alpha Legion would say only the Emperor can answer. And the Emperor, on his golden throne, has not been providing clear answers to any of his subjects for a very long time. The fourth current is the darkness, elements of the Alpha Legion that have drifted so far from the original vision that they retain only the methods, without any of the values that those methods were supposed to serve. Warbands that use Alpha Legion tradecraft to pursue goals of purely personal power. Cells that have aligned themselves with the ruinous powers not as a tactical convenience but as a genuine commitment. On individuals who have gone as far as Fireveus Karen went, who devoted themselves so completely to Khorne that they ceased to be recognizably Alpha Legion at all and became just another Chaos Lord with chains around their axe. These elements exist, and they are, in a way, the most straightforwardly understandable. They are what 10,000 years of war and isolation do to people who lose their purpose. They are the Alpha Legion's version of what almost all the other traitor legions became. The presence of all four currents within what is still recognizably the 20th Legion is itself a kind of testament to the durability of the organization. Most groups, subject to 10 millennia of fragmentation and independent operation, would have ceased to be recognizably the same group. The Alpha Legion retains enough shared identity, enough common methodology, enough cultural continuity across all its currents and divisions, that when Solomon Akura reaches out to 8 independent warbands and proposes coordinated action, 8 independent warbands are willing to consider the proposal. They still call themselves Alfarius. They still use the Hydra symbol. They still say Hydra Dominatus. After everything, the identity persists. This is because identity is something the Alpha Legion takes very seriously, in a way that is paradoxically the opposite of how it might appear. Their identity is built on the denial of fixed identity. I am Alfarius. Therefore, any Alpha Legionnaire is Alfarius. Therefore, the organization cannot be destroyed by attacking any specific individual. But the specific content of that identity, what Alfarius was, what the 20th Legion was for, what the Hydra symbol means, has been maintained across 10,000 years with a consistency that is remarkable given the fragmentation of everything else. The methods are maintained, the philosophical framework is maintained, the cultural markers are maintained, the mission parameters, in their most abstract form, are maintained. What is not maintained is any single point of control, any single chain of command, any single location where the Alpha Legion is headquartered and can be destroyed. They have institutionalized the principle that made them dangerous from the beginning. You cannot kill what you cannot find, and you cannot find what does not exist in a form that can be found. Expansion. The enemy of my enemy, Alpha Legion. Operations against chaos. One of the consistent features of the Alpha Legion's 10,000-year history that receives insufficient attention is their record of operational activity against other Chaos forces. This is not marginal or incidental. There is a substantial and well-documented pattern of Alpha Legion cells and warbands conducting operations that specifically target the plans of the ruinous powers, that undermine the operations of other traitor legions, and that produce outcomes favorable to the Imperium even when those outcomes are achieved through methods the Imperium would never sanction. This is not simply a matter of traitor legions fighting each other, which happens constantly and for entirely self-interested reasons. Yet the Alpha Legion's anti-chaos operations show a pattern that goes beyond the opportunistic violence of the long war's many internal conflicts. They look, to anyone who maps them carefully across the full span of the available record, like they are serving a purpose that is larger than any single cell's local interests. Consider the established pattern of Alpha Legion action around the operations of the Word-Bearers. The Word-Bearers are perhaps the most ideologically committed of the traitor legions, the true believers, the ones who turn to chaos, not out of rage or despair or calculated gamble, but out of what they genuinely understand as religious conviction. Their operations tend toward the establishment of cult networks that spread genuine chaos devotion, the summoning of demons for purposes that go beyond tactical convenience, and the long-term corruption of populations that they believe should be brought to worship the dark gods as a form of enlightenment. This is a goal that the Alpha Legion, whose own cult-seeding operations are tactical rather than devotional, has consistently worked to undermine. The specific ways in which Alpha Legion cults differ from Word-Bearer cults are subtle but significant. Alpha Legion cults are tools, maintained at whatever level of actual chaos involvement serves the Legion's purposes, and kept from developing the kind of deep daemonic entanglement that would make them genuinely useful to the ruinous powers. In regions where both legions operate, the evidence suggests that the Alpha Legion has, on multiple occasions, allowed or arranged for their own cells to be exposed and destroyed while ensuring that the Word-Bearer networks in the same region were identified and disrupted at a higher rate. Against the Black Legion, the pattern is different, but also present. Abaddon's Black Crusades are announced, preceded by years of preparation that involves the coordination of multiple traitor forces. The Alpha Legion participates in some of these crusades, or appears to participate, sends forces that nominally fight under the broader banner of the crusade. In some of these cases, the Alpha Legion contribution to the overall crusade has been, on careful retrospective analysis, negative. Forces that were supposed to secure specific objectives did not. Timing that was critical to the plan was disrupted in ways that look, with hindsight, like the result of something more than simple incompetence. Abaddon's coordination was disrupted by the failure of elements that were under Alpha Legion command at the relevant moment. This does not mean the Alpha Legion is secretly loyal. It does not mean that every operation they conduct is ultimately in the service of the Emperor's survival. The record also includes operations that unambiguously served Chaos's interests at the Imperium's expense, and there is no clean way to reconcile the two bodies of evidence into a single consistent picture. The most honest reading is that the Alpha Legion pursues goals that are not fully aligned with either side of the binary that structures the galaxy's major conflicts, and that actions which look pro-imperial from one angle look anti-imperial from another, because the actual goal is neither. The actual goal is whatever the original purpose was, and whether that purpose has been maintained with fidelity across 10,000 years, or has been corrupted and distorted until even the most sincere current inheritors of the tradition are serving something different from what Alpharius and Omegon intended, is the question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that the Alpha Legion fights on multiple fronts simultaneously, including fronts that the Imperium does not know are fronts, and some of those fronts are aimed at things that the Imperium would classify as its enemies if the Imperium could see them. That is not the same as being loyal. It might be something stranger and more complicated than loyalty. It might be the expression of a purpose that transcends the binary of loyal versus traitor in ways that the binary was never designed to accommodate. The Alpha Legion was always too sophisticated to fit cleanly into categories. 10,000 years have not made them simpler. Expansion, what it means to be Alpharius. There is a tradition within the Alpha Legion, older than the heresy itself, and almost certainly more important than any specific military doctrine, that deserves to be understood on its own terms. It is the tradition of identity as a shared resource rather than a personal possession. The tradition that says every member of the 20th Legion is Alpharius, not in a figurative sense, not as a metaphor for shared values or corporate identity, but in an operational sense that has been applied in ways ranging from the tactically convenient to the philosophically profound. During the Great Crusade, when Alpharius and Omegon first revealed themselves publicly, they instituted a practice that other legions found strange at best and deeply unsettling at worst: the deliberate cultivation of physical similarity between the Primarchs and their warriors. The Alpha Legion gene seed produces warriors who physically resemble their genofathers to an unusual degree: pale skin, a tendency toward particular facial structures, a similar build even accounting for the variation that Space Marine augmentation introduces. Alpharius and Omegon were, uniquely among the Primarchs, not significantly larger than their own warriors. A Space Marine of the 20th Legion, standing next to his Primarch, Vert was not immediately distinguishable from a distance or in poor lighting, and the Legion took this further, through training, through conditioning, through deliberate cultivation of mannerisms and movement patterns, until the statement, "I am Alpharius," was not simply a declaration, but a practical claim that could be operationally demonstrated. The psychosurgical conditioning that the Alpha Legion is known to apply to certain key operatives takes this further still. It is confirmed in the historical record that the 20th Legion has, on at least one documented occasion, conditioned an operative to genuinely believe themselves to be Alpharius, not pretending, not playing a role, but having their memories and identity replaced at a deep enough level that they would present as authentic to any interrogation technique short of the most invasive psychic assault. The fake was essentially impossible to detect because the fake was not, in any psychologically meaningful sense, faking. They were Alpharius. The real Alpharius, meanwhile, was somewhere else, doing something that the people hunting him were not watching. This practice of giving identity as something that can be shared, distributed, worn, passed on, and used as a resource rather than a personal claim, is one of the most radical things about the Alpha Legion's culture. In most organizations, your identity is your most fundamental possession. Your name, your history, your position in whatever hierarchy you occupy. The Alpha Legion treats identity as a tool, just something you pick up when it serves the mission and set down when it does not. Every member of the Legion can be Alpharius. Some have been Alpharius in ways that prevented even themselves from knowing they were doing it. The result is an organization in which the person you think you are talking to might not be the person you think you are talking to, in which the identity you believe you are engaging with might be a projection constructed specifically to ensure you draw incorrect conclusions about the situation. The famous war cry, the phrase that has followed the 20th Legion through 10,000 years of war, is not simply an expression of unity or a rallying call in the conventional sense. It is a declaration of this principle. When a warrior of the Alpha Legion says, "I am Alpharius," they are making a claim that is simultaneously personal and collective, simultaneously an assertion of individual identity and an assertion that individual identity is not what it appears to be. The many-headed Hydra, the symbol they have carried since before the heresy, represents this perfectly. Every head is the Hydra, and cutting off one head does not remove the Hydra because the Hydra is not in any single head. The Hydra is the pattern. The Hydra is the relationship between the heads. The Hydra is the capacity for regeneration. The Alpha Legion, at its best and most functioning, is not a collection of individuals with names and histories and personal loyalties. It is a pattern, a way of operating, and a shared understanding of how to move through the world and what moving through the world in that way is for. The individuals are expressions of the pattern, vessels for its continuation, and they can be replaced when they are lost because the pattern is larger than any of them. This is what makes the 20th Legion, uniquely among all the factions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, genuinely, structurally immortal in a way that goes beyond the individual immortality of its Space Marine warriors. Individuals can die. The pattern persists. Whether the pattern continues to serve the purpose it was originally designed for, or whether that purpose has been lost and the pattern now serves only itself, that is the question that 10,000 years have not answered. It is the question that the 42nd Millennium may or may not answer. Depending on what Solomon Akura and the Ghost Legion are building toward, depending on what Omegon is or is not doing in whatever corner of the galaxy he occupies, depending on what Kassa does with the Beacon of Sadreka, depending on 10,000 other threads that the Alpha Legion has been weaving for a very long time, and that are only now beginning to converge in ways that even the most attentive observers are struggling to track. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Alpha Legion is still fighting the war that most people do not know is happening. They were the Ghost Legion before anyone knew they existed. They will be the Ghost Legion long after everyone who is currently trying to stop them has moved on to other problems. Hydra Dominatus. The war is not over. It was never over. It will not be over until the pattern finally completes itself, or finally dissolves, or finally reveals what it has been building toward for 10,000 years of patient, invisible, devastating, implacable purpose. And when that moment comes, you probably will not see it coming. That is, after all, the whole point. Expansion. The harrowing. When the shadow strikes. It would be a serious mistake to let the Alpha Legion's reputation for subtlety and patience create the impression that they are reluctant fighters or incapable of direct violence. The entire point of the preparation that precedes a harrowing is that when the harrowing comes, it is overwhelming. Not because the Alpha Legion outnumbers its target, they frequently do not, because the target has been so thoroughly understood, so completely mapped, and so deeply penetrated at every level that the attack lands with the kind of precision that turns quantity into irrelevance. A smaller force that knows exactly where to hit, in what order, at what time, with what level of force to create cascading failures at every point simultaneously. That force defeats a larger defender who does not know what is happening until it is already over. The tactical DNA of the harrowing is visible in every Alpha Legion engagement, where the record is clear enough to analyze. They do not come at you straight. The first contact you have with the 20th Legion in an active engagement is almost never the most important thing that is happening. The first contact is a probe, an attack on a secondary target. It's an engagement that serves the purpose of drawing your attention and your response toward a threat that is real but not central. While you respond to that, something else is happening. Someone you trusted is not who you believed them to be. A supply route you relied on has been cut in a way that your communications infrastructure has not yet told you about. The reserves you plan to call on have been delayed by a bureaucratic error that originated 3 levels up in your administrative chain and which nobody in your chain of command knows was engineered. The fire that broke out in the eastern garrison this morning was not an accident. The patrol that did not return last week did not encounter an orc ambush. By the time the Central Alpha Legion force makes its real presence felt, and it does eventually make its presence felt, because the harrowing is not only subtlety, it is the application of real violence at the end of a long preparation. The target is already failing. The commander is making decisions based on an understanding of the battlefield that is days or weeks out of date. The communications channels that should be relaying updated information are either absent or carrying carefully edited versions of that information. The personnel who should be executing the defense are confused or compromised or simply not where they are supposed to be. or already dead from causes that have not been attributed to the incoming threat. In the context of the heresy and the early post-heresy period, when the Alpha Legion still had the organizational coherence to apply the harrowing at scale, yet the results were decisive in ways that other legions found almost impossible to replicate. Worlds that should have resisted for months fell in days. Fortifications that other legions had failed to breach became irrelevant before a single bolter round was fired at their walls. Commanders who had prepared extensively for every contingency found that every contingency had been prepared for by someone else first, and the preparations they were relying on were working against them. The harrowing is the culminating proof of the Alpha Legion's core thesis. Understanding an enemy completely is more powerful than any weapon. If you know everything about your target, genuinely everything at every level, with the quality of understanding that comes from having your own people inside the target's structure for months or years, then the target is already defeated. The actual attack is just the paperwork. This is why the Alpha Legion's methods are so difficult to counter, even when they are understood in principle. Understanding that the Alpha Legion will try to infiltrate your organization, will try to turn members of your staff, will try to map your vulnerabilities and cut your supply lines before the main assault. All of that understanding does not actually help you stop it, because you cannot distinguish between an Alpha Legion operative and a loyal servant until the operative has already served their purpose. The tools available to you for detecting infiltration are human tools operated by humans. And the Alpha Legion has spent 10,000 years specifically developing methods that human tools operated by humans will fail to detect. They have done this work against every major type of institution in the Imperium. They have learned from every case where they were detected. They have refined their methods accordingly. The organizations that try to counter them are not keeping pace. The gap between the Alpha Legion's infiltration capabilities and the Imperium's detection capabilities has, if anything, grown over 10,000 years. Because the Alpha Legion's methods improve continuously, while the Imperium's counterintelligence capability is periodically disrupted and sometimes set back decades by the very Alpha Legion operations it is trying to prevent. The harrowing has not been deployed at full scale since the heresy. What the fragmentation that followed the war and the deliberate reduction in operational size that the 20th Legion adopted as a survival strategy means that the kind of coordinated, galaxy-scale harrowing that the Legion conducted in the era of the Great Crusade and the heresy itself has not been possible for a very long time. Individual cells conduct their own version of the harrowing against local targets. A single planet, a single institution, a single chapter of Space Marines that has been identified as a priority. But the full expression of what the harrowing can be, applied at a scale that threatens not just single worlds, but entire sectors, has not been seen since Alfarius and Omegon led their full-strength legion. Solomon Akura and the Ghost Legion may be building toward changing that, as the coalition of 8 warbands that Akura has assembled represents the largest coordinated Alpha Legion force since the early post-heresy period. 8 groups, each with their own networks and their own capabilities and their own accumulated knowledge from decades or centuries of independent operation, now potentially available for a coordinated operation of the kind that individual warbands cannot conduct. If Akura is genuinely trying to reconstitute the harrowing at something approaching the scale it had during the heresy, and the evidence from his operations so far suggests this is exactly what he is building toward, then the Imperium is facing something it has not had to face in thousands of years. The preparation for something like that takes time, years, maybe decades. The kinds of networks that need to be built, the kinds of assets that need to be positioned, the kinds of vulnerabilities that need to be identified and cultivated. All of this requires the long patience that the Alpha Legion is famous for. The harrowing does not announce itself. It is already happening quietly, in dozens of places simultaneously, long before the moment when the evidence of its existence becomes undeniable. If you are reading this in the 42nd millennium and trying to calculate whether the Ghost Legion's preparations are already underway, there is something important you should understand about the Alpha Legion's approach to being observed. By the time you can see it, it has already accounted for you seeing it. Expansion. The question nobody can answer, but everybody must ask the most honest thing that can be said about the Alpha Legion. And after 10,000 years of their existence, and 10,000 years of people trying to understand them, is that the question of their ultimate purpose, what they are fighting for, what they are building toward, what they want the galaxy to look like at the end of their long operation, cannot be answered, not definitively, not with the information currently available, possibly not with any amount of information, because it is entirely possible that different parts of the Alpha Legion are working toward different and incompatible ends, and that there is no single answer to find. But the question is worth asking anyway, and worth asking carefully, because the different possible answers have very different implications for what the galaxy's future looks like.
Oh, the first possible answer is the one that requires the least complex explanation. The Alpha Legion is, at its core, a chaos-aligned traitor organization that happens to be more sophisticated than its counterparts, and its ultimate goal is the same as every other traitor organization: the overthrow of the Imperium and the expansion of Chaos's influence. Under this answer, the evidence of seemingly pro-Imperial actions is either coincidental. Alpha Legion interests sometimes align with Imperial interests without this reflecting any deeper loyalty, tactical, undermining one enemy to better serve the overall anti-Imperial agenda, or simply the result of the kind of long-horizon planning that sometimes requires serving a future enemy in the present to be in a better position to harm them later. This explanation is clean.
It requires no appeals to secret loyalties or 10,000-year plans that have maintained their direction across a vast span of fragmentation and change. It treats the Alpha Legion as exactly what they nominally are, and does not require the interpreter to believe anything particularly unusual about the nature of loyalty or the durability of purpose across millennia. The problem with this answer is that it does not account for Saint Celestine and the beacon of Tzedreka. It does not account for the pattern of Alpha Legion action against other Chaos forces that goes beyond simple opportunistic conflict. It does not account for the behavior of elements like Occam, the untrue, who speaks openly about his conviction that the Alpha Legion is the Emperor's test rather than his enemy. And a simple "they are traitors with better tactics" explanation leaves too many data points without an explanation. The second possible answer is the opposite extreme. The Alpha Legion has been secretly loyal throughout the 10,000 years since the heresy, serving the Emperor's purpose through means the Emperor cannot sanction, operating as the ultimate deep-cover intelligence agency for a civilization that officially does not know it exists. Under this answer, the seemingly anti-imperial actions are either disinformation, tactical misdirection, or the necessary costs of maintaining cover deep inside enemy territory. As the harrowing that destroyed the Emperor's swords was not Alpha Legion treachery, it was a necessary sacrifice to maintain the cover that allows the Alpha Legion to operate against Chaos forces that would otherwise be unreachable. The cults they seed are not genuine corruption. They are intelligence assets that generate information about the spread of Chaos within the Imperium, maintained at the minimum level of genuine Chaos involvement needed to keep them credible. The problem with this answer is that it requires believing that an organization has maintained a secret pro-imperial agenda across 10,000 years of independent operation by dozens of autonomous cells with no central coordination. The chances that every cell, across that span of time, has maintained the discipline and the ideological clarity needed to keep that agenda alive, without any of them defecting, without any of them losing the thread, without any external catastrophe disrupting the carefully maintained network. Strain credibility past the point where the explanation earns its way. The third answer, and the one that feels most honest given everything that is known, is that the Alpha Legion is not one thing and never was. During the heresy, it was one thing: a unified force executing a decision made by two Primarchs in consultation with an alien organization, pursuing a goal that they had decided transcended conventional loyalty.
After the heresy, as the unity dissolved and the cells went their separate ways, it became many things simultaneously. And different currents developed different understandings of what the mission was and what serving it required. Some retained the original vision in a form they could articulate. Some lost it and replaced it with simpler, more immediately useful frameworks. Some continued the operation because the operation was what they knew how to do, regardless of whether they could tell you what the operation was for. And some, at the furthest edges of the distribution, became something that the founders of the 20th Legion would probably not recognize as continuous with what they had created. The Alpha Legion at the start of the heresy was a plan. The Alpha Legion in the 42nd Millennium is the residue of that plan, maintained through the inertia of identity and method and culture, are still moving in roughly the direction it was originally pointed, but with much more variance and uncertainty than the original design intended. Some of that movement is directed and purposeful. Some of it is pattern matching. Operatives and warbands doing what Alpha Legion operatives and warbands do, because that is what they know how to do, without always having a clear answer to the question of what it is for. And some of it, the most interesting parts, the parts that make the Alpha Legion something more than just the most sophisticated of the traitor legions, reflect something that survived from the original vision. An awareness that the war being fought is not the one most people can see, and a commitment to finding the path that the Cabal said didn't exist, the path where humanity survives and chaos is defeated and the long, terrible grinding of the long war finally reaches its conclusion. Whether that path exists, whether the Alpha Legion is anywhere close to finding it, whether the thing they are building toward in the 42nd Millennium represents genuine progress toward a goal that will matter for the galaxy's future, none of that can be confirmed. None of it may ever be confirmed. The Alpha Legion has spent 10,000 years being the thing that cannot be confirmed. But here is what can be said with reasonable confidence about the 20th Legion as they exist in the current era. They have outlasted every attempt to destroy them. That they have maintained their identity and their methods and their organizational culture across a span of time that has seen the rise and fall of civilizations. They are active, coordinated at a scale not seen since the post-heresy period, and apparently building towards something significant in the current era. They possess the Pale Spear, the weapon that killed a Primarch and almost killed another, and they are apparently treating its recovery as a strategic priority. They hold a position of trust with a living saint that should, by all conventional analysis, be impossible. They are, in every meaningful sense, still fighting a war that began before the Horus heresy and has not ended in 10,000 years of everything the galaxy has thrown at it. Where whatever they are fighting for, and the honest answer is that we do not know, they have not stopped fighting for it. That is either the most terrifying thing about them or the most remarkable. Possibly both. The galaxy has changed enormously in 10,000 years. The Imperium that the Alpha Legion was created to serve has become something that the Emperor of that era would barely recognize. The chaos powers that motivated the Cabal's desperate gamble are more present and more powerful than they were when Alpharius and Omegon made their impossible decision on Nerth. The galaxy itself has been physically divided by a wound in reality that makes navigation a matter of faith rather than science across vast swaths of the sky. And the 20th Legion is still out there, still patient, still watching, still preparing, still, in the truest sense of the word that any of us can access, Alpharius. Thank you for staying with this exploration all the way to the end. If you have made it here, then you understand why the Alpha Legion occupies such a special place in the lore. They reward precisely this kind of sustained attention, and every layer you pull back reveals another layer beneath it. That is a design feature, not an accident. It is appropriately exactly how the Alpha Legion would want to be understood. If this kind of comprehensive deep dive is what you come here for, please subscribe to Q on 40K. This channel exists for exactly this purpose, taking the parts of this universe that deserve more sustained examination than they usually get, and giving them the attention they have earned. Or drop a comment telling me what the Alpha Legion means to you and what you believe they are ultimately working toward. Leave a like if this helped you understand them differently than you did before. I will see you in the next one. Hydra Dominatus. Expansion, the Pale Spear, the Ghost Legion, and what is being built. Let us spend a little more time with what is actually happening in the 42nd millennium, because the current era represents something genuinely new in the 10,000-year history of the Alpha Legion, and understanding it requires holding in mind everything we have been discussing about the organization's history, methods, and possible purposes. Solomon Akura's Ghost Legion Coalition is not simply a temporary alliance of convenience. The name itself is significant, beyond what a casual reading would suggest. When the 20th Legion was first known to exist, in those early years of the Great Crusade, when reports of unknown space marines kept turning up in war zones without any identifying markings, the name that stuck to them was the Ghost Legion. It was not a name they gave themselves. It was a name that emerged from the experience of everyone who encountered them. They were there, and then they were gone, and the evidence that they had ever been there was minimal and strange and difficult to interpret. The Ghost Legion, the force that haunts the edges of awareness without fully resolving into something you can engage with directly. Akura's choice to call his coalition by this name is a statement of intent, and he is reaching back to the very beginning of the 20th Legion's existence, to the period before they were officially acknowledged, before Alfarius was found, before the Cabal's approach and the terrible decision on Earth. He is claiming that the pure form of the Alpha Legion was what they were before all of that, the Emperor's secret instrument, the force that did the things that could not be done by warriors who operated in the light. The Ghost Legion. Whether this is genuine, whether Akura's project is a sincere attempt to recover the original purpose of the 20th Legion and restore it to something like the role it was created to serve, or whether it is a sophisticated manipulation, a claim to a narrative that legitimizes the coalition without actually committing to its implications, that is exactly the kind of question that cannot be answered from outside the Alpha Legion. It is the kind of question that the Alpha Legion was designed to make unanswerable. What can be said is that the Pale Spear is real, and its recovery is apparently a genuine strategic priority. The Pale Spear is an alien weapon of extraordinary provenance. Its origin is not definitively established. It was found by Omegon on the world where he grew up alone, and its history before that is obscure. What is known is that the Primarch Alfarius carried it, that it was the weapon he brought to the Battle of Pluto when he fought Rogel Dawn, that it was the weapon that should have killed Dawn if Dawn had not sacrificed his arm to trap it. It is a weapon associated specifically with the Alpha Legion's highest leadership, with the twin Primarchs. As with the original vision, with the concentrated authority that the 20th Legion has not had in 10,000 years. Akura has obtained most of it, not all of it. The Pale Spear was apparently fragmented, and some fragments are still missing, which is why the coalition includes what appears to be an ongoing recovery effort as one of its active submissions. The specific significance of having most but not all of the spear is not entirely clear from available information. It might be a powerful weapon that functions better as a complete artifact. It might be a symbol of legitimate authority within the Alpha Legion's own tradition. Whoever holds the Pale Spear holds, in some sense, the claim to the twin Primarch's legacy. It might be connected to something specific about Omegon's plans or whereabouts, since it was originally his before it was his brother's. Or it might be all three of these things simultaneously, because the Alpha Legion rarely does things for only one reason. What is clear is that the Ghost Legion coalition is serious, organized, and operating on a scale that has not been seen in the post-heresy history of the 20th Legion. 8 warbands, a harrowmaster with exceptional tactical credentials and apparent access to legacy equipment that should not exist outside the oldest Alpha Legion cells, headhunters and Lernean terminators, units that were the elite of the elite during the heresy, and whose continuation into the 42nd millennium speaks to the extraordinary continuity of certain elements of the 20th Legion. An ongoing intelligence operation that apparently reaches into some of the most sensitive and obscure corners of the current galaxy's political and military landscape. Something is being built. The Alpha Legion has been building things for 10,000 years, and most of those buildings have not been visible to observers until they were already complete and already in motion. The Ghost Legion Coalition is more visible than most Alpha Legion projects, which is itself a potentially significant data point. Visibility that is this controlled, from an organization that controls its visibility this precisely, is either an unavoidable side effect of operating at the necessary scale. You cannot coordinate 8 warbands without generating some observable footprint, or it is deliberate. The Alpha Legion sometimes lets things be seen. When they do, it is usually because what is visible is less important than what is not, and the visible thing serves to direct attention away from what matters. In the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium, the Alpha Legion is conducting the most coordinated operation it has attempted since the early post-heresy period. The galaxy around it is simultaneously more vulnerable and more chaotic than it has been in centuries. The Cicatrix Maledictum has divided the Imperium, cut communications, isolated whole sectors, and created conditions of uncertainty and fear that are, from an Alpha Legion perspective, the optimal operating environment. The Inquisition is stretched across a galaxy that is larger in a practical sense than it has ever been. The Loyalist Space Marine chapters are fighting on dozens of fronts simultaneously, while the traitor legions are mobilizing in ways that the Imperium is devoting most of its available attention to tracking and countering. And in the middle of all this, moving in the spaces between every other faction's line of sight, the 20th Legion is running a plan that has probably been in preparation for longer than any current observer knows, toward a goal that none of those observers can fully see. The Hydra grows its heads back. The Ghost Legion is still haunting the edges, and somewhere in the dark between stars, in a chamber that no cartograph shows and no navigator has charted, someone is reviewing the operation and considering whether the time for the harrowing is finally approaching. They have been patient for 10,000 years. Their patience is not infinite. It is, however, precisely calibrated to end at exactly the right moment. Hydra Dominatus.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.